Good evening. It is Tuesday, September 29th. This is the Board of Education meeting, our workshop meeting for Guilford, Connecticut Public Schools. Welcome. We are in our first hybrid meeting tonight, so you will notice that some Board of Ed members and administrators are here at the high school in person, and others are joining us remote. We just held our policy meeting in the same fashion, so we hope to run this meeting as successfully as the last one. Today's workshop meeting, we're going to be discussing priorities and initiatives for Guilford Public Schools this year, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Freeman.
Thank you, Dr. Bellis-Tracy. Generally, this time every year, we come to you after the leadership team has met fairly extensively to discuss plans for our priorities and initiatives moving forward into the school year. And then after that initial conversation, the board then has a follow-up conversation as we establish those priorities and initiatives for each school year. This year, that has happened to a much lesser extent with the rush for redesign and reopening and with the planning that the principals have had on their plate. What we're doing tonight is inviting a collaborative conversation. So rather than two full conversations in different parts, we've asked representatives of the leadership team to join us here tonight. So Dr. Crystal is here with us and Mr. Grimm is here with us in the room. And I know that joining us virtually, we have Ms. Chaff and Mrs. Ryan. So we do have representatives of the principals and the leadership team part of this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you all for.
Additionally, I think because of the realities of the environment in which we find ourselves, that the conversation around priorities and initiatives needs to be somewhat limited or restricted this year. In fact, as we launched the opening of the school year and met with teachers across the district, we talked about the importance of recognizing limitations and embracing the limitations that we find around ourselves as we move into the school year. And in fact, we shared a TED Talk that talked about finding creativity within those limitations. So we're not suggesting that this school year is not going to be vigorous or creative or exciting, but we do need to recognize those limitations that are around us and I think focus our energies in a certain way that may be different than other ways. So in front of you, what I've shared with each of you is just a draft, just a place to begin a conversation around priorities and initiatives for this year. The priorities, which appear on the top of your page, are unchanged from the past 2 or 3 years. These priorities really have been essentially a foundation for 10 years now. They've evolved over those 10 years. But the first priority speaks to the social emotional environment that we intend to create in our school system. Our schools will be physically and emotionally safe, healthy, equitable, and caring places for learning, built upon supportive relationships and positive decision-making. That has been our starting point, and I can't think of a better starting point as we enter into this full pandemic year of schooling. The second priority talks about the professional environment that we strive to create in our school system and focuses on the profession of teaching. And that reads, teaching and learning will be supported by instructionally focused leadership, subject area coaches and specialists, professional learning communities, and instructional resources. We need to resource our teachers appropriately in order for them to be effective professionals. And again, I think more than any other year, this year is important for that priority to remain in place. And finally, if we create the social emotional environment we want, if we create the professional environment for which we strive, we then talk about that classroom and learning environment. And the third priority reads, all students will engage in academically rigorous tasks in every class. Instruction will be aligned to content area standards, integrated with the principles of learning, and measured by the ongoing collection of evidence of learning and observations of instruction. Again, I feel that this year, we need to embrace the priorities that have gotten us to where we are. We need to protect those priorities this year, and we need to be careful that we don't forget those and slide away, that we don't make poor instructional decisions because of the realities of the pandemic within which we find ourselves. But I likewise would caution against dramatically changing those priorities this year and striving further in a year that is so challenged. And so, my first suggestion would be that we consider keeping the 3 priorities in place. Initiatives have evolved year to year, and in most years we have 6 or 7 initiatives.
Can I interrupt you
Of
for
course.
2 seconds? I'm getting word that our
It's working,
on the
it's working
phone
now.
remotely don't have a copy of this. Is there?
Yep,
Oh.
Kevin, could you share your screen and bring up slide number 5, please?
To say the live wasn't working, it was still playing policy before, but it's working now.
Just one moment, there you go.
Awesome.
I apologize. So all of you
Thank
participating
you.
are looking at the same document now.
Thanks, Myra.
So the second part of that is that I would suggest that we consider, generally in a given school year, we've got 6 or 7 initiatives that we're tackling, and some of them become pretty granular in detail. They have focused in the past on specific subject areas, specific curricular revisions, specific teaching strategies that we've been employing in the classroom. This year, I think that I want to begin this conversation by suggesting that we should look at 3 significant areas. The first one is that we need to maintain health and hygiene protocols and practices that will provide safe and healthy in-person environments for all students and members of the school community. This year, more than any year, health and safety needs to be our primary concern. Look at the environment in which we're meeting right now. And I think that we need to recognize that the majority of our principal and teacher time and cognitive energies are going in this direction. And so I think that it's important that we identify it as our first initiative. But right on the heels of that is that we support a blended learning environment that promotes deep learning and academic disciplines, as well as social and emotional wellness for students attending school in person and virtually. Even in between meetings, we were chatting a little bit about the reality of teachers who are juggling students who are both in school with them physically and at home virtually. And even once we move past our full reopening, we're still tracking about 9% of our population who will remain at home for distance support. I think the blended learning environment is a continuum that will support us whether we're in hybrid, fully open, or whether we even need to retreat to fully distance. And again, our teachers are learning, we're developing, we're changing, states are changing requirements for us as we move through. So I think that that becomes foundational to all of the instructional work being done and needs to be an area of focus this year. And then finally, I would suggest that our third initiative be around the work that we've begun around equity and race and privilege and social justice. And I would suggest that we further develop instructional practices and environments that foster equity and social justice in our community. And I've already jotted down on my paper that this might better read our learning community or school community. We're really focused on our schools, and we're an important part of the larger community, but we're responsible for our school community. Again, I should have put draft on the top of this sheet. I'll ask each of you just to write draft. I'm excited that we're having this conversation collaboratively as a combined leadership team, not in 2 parts this year. And I would just offer that humbly as what I think a logical starting point might be for this most unusual of school years. I'll also note that since I write to each of those initiatives in my end of the year reflection for you, this will make a much shorter packet with only 3 rather than 7.
The incentives here are varied. I want to open this up to the floor for Board of Ed members, administrators who are looking at some of these initiatives or the district priorities and have thoughts, comments, considerations.
Given where we are with the pandemic, putting the pandemic aside, what would have been your direction? What would have been your initiatives? I'm trying to look at it as, if not, what else? It's
a really good question, and I had a moment where I went blank because
it's been the focus for so long.
It's been the focus since really February, right? February we began seeing this and planning for this.
Mm-hmm.
I can quickly tell you that the topic of race and systemic racism and equity and justice would have been on. We had begun working on that more than a year ago. It was something that we were moving towards. That would for sure be on our plate this year. We were working over the last couple of years on social emotional wellness, and I think that there's a nexus between those two topics. I think instructionally, we were continuing to work on the 3 high leverage instructional practices of academically productive talk, as well as using feedback thoughtfully and in a structured way, and using writing as a tool for thinking and learning. We were also looking at assessment practice, particularly in the area of science. We were still really digging into using formative assessment to guide our science instruction. And we are still doing that work. We have redesigned the contract. It'll be more virtual than in person, but that work that we did in Adams for the last year and a half will be shifting up to the high school this year. What else would we have done if this were a normal school year?
Probably would have looked at more task design tasks that are inclusive and not excluding any students.
We were moving coaching. Coaching was being built out through Adams into the high school. There would have been a strong focus, and we were continuing to work with video as a reflective tool, and we were beginning to see more voluntary teacher engagement with the tool. So it's a really interesting question. Quite honestly, this is the most thought I've given to that question.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Probably since February.
Yeah.
And I don't think that work has stopped.
No.
Right,
It's just
exactly.
slowed-
Yeah, it's
just
yes.
slowed in progress.
Right.
And I think we're trying to be responsive to the teachers and the families that are bearing the weight of the pandemic. We're not shelving any of that work, but trying to balance it with the tech support that's necessary, with the focus on blended learning that is going to be necessary. Anything, Bill?
I mean, we were, last fall and then into the winter, we were looking at some new science materials and things like that. We've done a school visit and we've gotten some materials into pilot at like the 3rd grade level. So that kind of just kind of stopped at that point. And anything like that would be a challenge anyway, even if we have just a few kids at home.
Right.
Figuring out how to be equitable in that.
That's probably one example of something we really have paused. But on the other hand, the reading supports in the youngest grades, we are looking more at more phonemic supports in the youngest grades for reading instruction, and that work is also still continuing this year. And I guess we're really not, all the work is continuing. I just think that these become important lenses for looking at that work, and certainly more broad than granular when you think about those lenses.
Other thoughts? Anyone around the table or remote? Questions, thoughts?
Sure. Dr. Freeman, what are you thinking where we've got ongoing collection of evidence of learning and observation as how we're going to measure kids? Do you think kids are going to get traditional grades this year, or are we going to stick with something similar to what we did for the 4th quarter of last year?
Again, a really thoughtful question. That priority was written pre-pandemic. That priority is probably 8 or 9 years old, and the language around collection of evidence of learning is probably new in the last 2 or 3 years. Before that, we were talking about state and local assessments was the way that we were phrasing that. So as a district, we were trying to be more broad about what we were saying we look at as evidence of learning, and how do we think about that in ways that are a little bit beyond traditional grades. And we were moving in that direction kind of slowly and thoughtfully, intentionally. The pandemic last year forced us to move it at a quicker pace, right? And we needed to say, well, if the kids are all home, how do we measure that learning? I think this year, if we can stay on the trajectory that we planned, which is the slow opening through hybrid with a full opening in mid to late October, the idea would be moving back to more traditional familiar grades, and then reverting back to this slow, thoughtful work about really questioning how we measure student learning and what's the difference between recognizing learning and supporting that and grading kids in the traditional way. On the other hand, if we end up extending this hybrid window, or worse, having to retreat to full distance again at some point, then we may have to again be thoughtful about that and probably not move so far back towards our traditional grading system and remaining in something that looked more. And grades again are really different. At the elementary level, we're not grading students, we're reporting on their progress. We begin assigning grades at the middle and high school levels and modified that in different ways at those levels last year. It's really going to be a condition, it's going to be a fixture of what condition we're in at the time of the grades. We might grade quarter one might be graded very differently than quarter two if we see the second wave that we're still monitoring for. I don't know if that was a complete answer or not.
I'll just add that we've got some pockets around the district too, and we've been really examining what does it mean to grade kids and what are the benefits of this and what are the challenges associated with it. So we've had places where we've started these conversations about what is the purpose of an assessment, and is it assessment for learning as opposed to assessment of learning, and when does it happen during the learning process. So that's, that would probably be an answer to John's question, one of those things that we've started talking about that has slowed a little bit because of the shift in the structure. But it's something we're thinking about definitely.
It's really central
I'm
to the
just going to
science
pause
work.
the conversation a second. We're getting some feedback that we should just try to speak up a little bit.
Okay. I also thought you were going to pause and see if anybody virtually, right? So I think we're focusing a little bit on the table. It would be good to open it up to anybody participating virtually.
Go ahead, Moira.
No, I've been I was letting Katie know it's a little difficult to hear voices beyond Paul's. Paul, you project your voice very well, but it's just getting a little garbled when others speak. I don't know if it's their position at the table, but
Thank you.
no, I appreciate the outline you presented, and I can understand the circumstances that we're in, that we can't consider a typical, priorities and initiatives outline. But to what John was saying, was there anything that you feel that might, like, this is the document for the year, but say things go really well and we're more in a full attendance and we feel like, we've kind of, God willing, this is more under control. Do you feel you'd ever want to revisit this, or do you want to just establish this for the year and let that be it?
That's a really interesting question. I would certainly be open to, right? We've never done that in the past, but we should probably think about revisiting this in January and talk about where do we find ourselves now, and right, have we sort of outstripped this? Have we done better than anticipated? I will say that the third initiative, the idea of intentionally keeping that focus and not allowing the pandemic to take our focus away from conversations about race and equity and justice. That's there intentionally so that we don't lose that focus this year and just make all things pandemic at all times. But I absolutely think that we could report mid-year on these in a way that opens up the conversation for amendment. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think more the second one, right? It's always going to be a priority this whole year, and whatever, how long, the health and hygiene protocols are not going to change, even if everyone's back and we're still going to be masking and cleaning. And
we created a document for the administrative and teaching staff that is it's a visual, and it starts with a familiar red umbrella. It's a circle. And across the top is a red umbrella, which is an image we used some years ago to focus our attention to the ideas of social and emotional wellness. At the bottom of the circle is the grounding, the foundation of this blended learning platform that we're in. But in the center of the circle are all the discrete areas of professional development that we are still talking about this year. The high leverage practices, the assessment conversations that we've had, acceleration of learning, the new literacy components that we're building in, the cultural responsiveness. And so I think you're right. I think that middle one does become a catch-all for all the instructional work that will be continuing. But I do think it phrases it in a way that is honest to the situation and respectful of the teachers' efforts, that we have to make sure we're supporting their ability to do it across this continuum before we keep moving forward and improving that practice. There's a new there's a new reality that undergirds that practice now. The first thing to do is strengthen and secure what we have before then moving forward. But Moira, it's a great point. If things are going really positively, we shouldn't just be okay with treading water this year. We should revisit it and talk about how are we moving that work forward.
I have a question about the third one, and just how far the way it is written takes us, right? So further develop instructional practices and environments that foster equity and social justice in our, it sounds like school community or something. You know, so when we were considering the mascot, right, there were, you know, one of the things I think we did some discussing about, one of the things that I was conscious of is there were certainly requests from our larger school community, parents, community members about, or my interpretation is really teaching about some of, for instance, of the Native history from Guilford. So does this third initiative in your mind, is it content focused as well as practice focused?
I was just going to ask that. What does the third initiative look like?
Yeah, so it's both, right? So on the 21st of this month, Dr. Crystal and all of the instructional coaches district-wide spent a full day with Dr. Don Seiler from the University of St. Joseph talking about culturally responsive instructional techniques. We have a follow-up meeting with him where we're going to be talking about continuing that curriculum audit, and it looks like we'll be using a tool out of New York University that was developed by Dr. David Kirkland, and Dr. Seiler will be sort of helping us as we use that auditing tool. I want to talk with Dr. Seiler about here at the high school conducting empathy interviews where you know, our data doesn't necessarily show discrepancy between performance of students of color and white students. To a large degree, that's because the N is so small, that we are so predominantly white that looking just at the numbers doesn't necessarily bring up everything that we want to surface. The idea of Dr. Seiler meeting with those students of color and talking to them about their lived experiences raises the anecdotal. And what is your perception of your experience in the school, even if you're not getting suspended at greater numbers, and even if you have the opportunity to enroll in the same courses as the white student population does, and continuing that work as well. We met, all teachers did work on trauma-informed instruction, which goes to the reality that all of our students have gone through over these past 6 months, and how do we make sure that our classrooms are open and understanding environments for students who have gone through that level of trauma in their experiences before coming into our classrooms. Trying to think, where else are we going with all this work?
We also have a focus with all the social studies teachers
Right.
to talk about cultural responsive teaching and the curriculum. And Ralph, who's our department chair here, is going to be organizing vertical social studies conversations that go from K-12 to get up to
Right, and tomorrow, in fact, I can't believe I missed that one. Tomorrow, we will be launching the first edition of the Our Direction newsletter for this school year. And we're really happy that that newsletter, other than in a passing reference, does not talk about the pandemic. It does talk about the way in which we plan on continuing to address the study of history here in our schools. American history, Native history, race as it impacts history, all of that. And in fact, it links to a TED Talk that talks about hard history. How do we look at hard history in a way that is not slanted in one direction or another, but is honest and looks at what happened historically and gives our students the opportunity to really examine that. So we will be looking at the ways in which we teach history in the schools. We've looked at the texts related to the English language arts courses, particularly here at the high school. We're talking about instructional techniques for all teachers across the district, using the coaches as that lever. And then, as I mentioned, we will be completing the equity audit as well as the empathy interviews, many of which were on the lists that we received in some 200 emails back in June of this year, when a number of recent graduates were expressing to us the work that they wanted to see us engaging in the district. And so that bottom bullet there speaks to all of that, as well as the mascot work that we've done. I will be meeting with Dr. Matoma, Glenn Matoma, who joined us at a board meeting back in June. He and I are going to be in a meeting Friday together and want to make sure that we're continuing that relationship with Acamont as well, and using the Acamont initiative to help us as we shape that Native history as well. But Native history is also hard history. It's not just a nostalgic look at the people who lived in Guilford over time. It really means looking carefully at what happened, and that there are different ways of recording what really happened, and how do we help our kids sift through that on their own.
I'm going to ask other people their thoughts or comments, and ask to help people on remote hear us better, to make sure we say our name first and then speak loudly. Again, we're getting some input that some of us have required.
Okay.
Other thoughts, other comments, other questions, suggestions? Anyone on remote?
Well, I just like to say, in response to what Dr. Crystal was saying, and Dr. Freeman, the priority about hybrid learning, our work that the district provided for us and that we provided for teachers really included how do we embed those high leverage practices and everything that we know that is good about instruction into the hybrid model. And we are really seeing the teachers implement that quite a bit within that hybrid model. So we're not expecting any of those great practices that Guilford has prided itself on to go away. We're really pushing teachers to be doing that as they implement the hybrid learning. So it's challenging without question, but it's also what we expect for our teachers. The other thing that we had been working on in the past is really the self-management of learning for our children. And in a weird way, the hybrid model allows us to give our children more autonomy of their own learning and requires them some independence with that feedback that Dr. Freeman talked about. So it gives us the opportunity to promote the self-management of learning that Guilford has been really focusing on in the past couple of years as well.
That's terrific. And would you, I mean, would it be a suggestion to get some of that wording in there, or no? I mean, would it be a suggestion to get somehow high level practices into that second one, so that, or not?
I mean, we could. I do worry that we're going to start building everything back in that we.
No,
so
I understand. And I think it needs to be authentic about where we are. I just, I don't want people, as this conversation is shaping up, we are identifying that this is a different school year, but that our focus is high leverage practices, coaching, all these things are not lost in this year. It's just that we have a couple of other things, really important things that we've had to add. So I just want to make sure that anyone reading this understands that.
I'm going to apologize for this, but I'm going to raise my voice to Mr. Mitchell. Kevin, I just sent you the visual that we've used during the opening of school. Could you open up your email and share that image, the circle image with blended learning that I was describing before? Yeah, I think we could certainly tease out right in that middle instructional bullet if we needed to.
It's a thought. I don't feel so. I just would like
even
to
if it was
sure
a parenthetical reference. Yeah.
Right. I just want to make sure that I think Mandy's comment here is so important, right? That these things are not put on hold. Some things have had to certainly been put on hold, but certainly the approach to teaching is now trying to be incorporated into a new setting, but not lost.
Right. Even a parenthetical notation in there that included some of the most foundational pieces, the principles of learning, the high leverage practices.
It's a suggestion.
No, but
it's an uncomfortable fit here then.
But we could throw parentheses in anywhere. Mandy, the self-management of learning that Mandy referenced is one of 9 principles of learning. And so by simply referencing the PLOs, the PLLs, the principles of learning, as well as the high leverage practices, we get a lot of content in there. So this is the image that I was describing previously. Right, all of this is happening this year in an environment of health, wellness, and learning. Right, health is paramount this year, but we're also concerned about emotional wellness, and obviously we're still a school system. We're still focused on learning. I really like that the umbrella is there because that is an image that is familiar to the community, especially to the teaching staff. They all got magnets with red umbrellas on them around social emotional wellness. That triangle in the middle is the instructional core. That comes from Richard Elmore's work out of Harvard, and teachers in Guilford know the instructional core, and that the three bubbles have gotten pretty small, but they're labeled content, student, and teacher. And in the center of it is the task. What are we asking kids to do? And then you see the high leverage practices, right? That's the student discourse, that's the feedback, that's their writing. There's the assessment that we talked about, the science, and we discussed. So all of that is there, and it sits on that foundation of blended learning. I do think that we could drop a parenthetical, right? We could just put some of the most important components in the middle of that initiative in the same way that we put it in the middle of this visual. I'd be happy to do that and have that. So what we were thinking was if we have this conversation tonight,
Yeah.
I will bring it back to you in your October meeting, and we'll have
Great.
that addition and any other suggestions that we take away from this conversation tonight. Kevin, thank you for putting the visual up.
Other thoughts,
I'd like to talk a little bit about the emotional wellness component that we referenced throughout this.
Yep.
Obviously, it's a weird year. I see that we're talking about trauma and how these kids have been affected. I'm also wondering if we need to do anything with regard to social media and technology, because I feel like now these kids are relying so much on social media as their means of connecting with each other, and that makes me nervous. It makes me nervous. Something that we all talked about back in, oh gosh, it was, I think, January. We brought this up at one of our workshop meetings about, social bullying, and I'm just worried about that. Like, do we have any idea, anything that we can insert in here that might make sense to help kids understand the ramifications of what they're putting online? Anything, any other safeguards that we think we might be implementing this year to help with emotional wellness?
It's an interesting point because they're communicating so differently than they're used to.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're right. It's part of everyday conversation. I think every time we talk about in-person and virtual in here, at least in the back of my mind, that's part of what we're talking about. So already this year, we've had conversations with students about the acceptable use policy and appropriate behavior in Zoom meetings. We've had conversations with parents about Zoom meetings and the best practices that we expect for parents in those settings, right? Parents are now in and out of the classroom in ways that doesn't happen when you're in person, especially when you've got younger children who need tech support, and at home it's parents who are providing the tech support. It's definitely something that we're doing. It's definitely baked into that second initiative. When I look at that, again, we could make sure that we include it in that parenthetical reference that, the things that we're focusing on include, the instructional core and the high leverage practices and the principles of learning and, social media citizenship, right? Something that just calls that out. And again, when we talk about, students attending in person or virtually, in my mind, that's there, but I think we need to make it more clear in the text that that's part of what we're referencing.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that conversation, Kristen. It really comes down to respect. Our children get taught to respect at home and in the school system, and they kind of get thrown into that social media reliance due to this pandemic. And as adults, we all know that we brought up a certain way. Now we're involved in our careers with the proper respect of attending meetings, whether online or in person. Some of these children are probably getting thrown into the online world with little respect at this time because they have to learn as they get older. And maybe adding that word in this priority, they're being respectful as a being taught that, or make sure we use that as we go forward, like a blended learning environment that promotes deep learning, respect, and academic disciplines as well as social and emotional wellness. Maybe the word respect added it.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's either that or it's like being a responsible digital citizen or something like that.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. Just coming up through this conversation, we just, we're talking about, these initiatives to support these priorities, but in here, there's no mention of the support at home that's required to support these initiatives. And I wonder if that needs to be part of
I think that's
part of this.
I mean, in my mind, that's part of the way that we roll that out.
Yeah.
But this document speaks to what we are, right?
Yep.
This is our side of the compact,
Got it.
right? The community's
Yeah.
got an important side of the compact too, and we need to put that out. when
More
we
than ever,
share
yeah.
this. But I've always sort of seen that as this is our side of the agreement.
Yeah.
I want to get some of the language that we're talking about here.
What did
Yep.
you say, Bill?
Responsible.
Responsible digital
Digital
citizenship.
citizenship.
Right.
I agree. I think those are really good points. I feel like I'm screaming, but.
You have to yell.
Yeah,
Screens
Yeah.
over here.
I think they're very good points because, I mean, even in my own house, because there's 50% of the time they're not with other people other than their siblings or more really. You know, they just resort to this and, you know, everything, and they lose that piece of human interaction, and we probably have to remind them of that. I mean, I know, you know, I have tried much harder than ever to get people off Xbox, and because they don't know what else to do with themselves. And that's where they go to.
Well, for what it's worth, I mean, I do feel like I need to push a little bit and defend our students. There's a lot of really bad adult modeling
Oh,
for
Yeah.
behavior and a lack of a
1000%.
responsible and respectful use of social media. I think that our kids are going to lead us, right, in how to use those tools better. But I think the phraseology is right. I just don't want to suggest that all the adults do it well and our kids struggle. We could learn a lot from our kids in some of these environments.
Right.
Other thoughts? Anyone want to offer on any of these initiatives or the priorities or something that they feel might be missing at the moment from them?
I can already see how the second initiative is going to come back changed for you when we have this back to you in October. And again, there's no pressure to approve it in October. It could be an iterative conversation. It doesn't have to be an up or down vote when we bring this back to you in October.
Okay.
But that one, I do appreciate the conversation. I'm still hearing that the three priorities, which are sort of bigger umbrella pieces, remain
they're great.
foundational and remain.
Yeah.
We'll tinker with those initiatives, particularly number 2, and get in some of the specifics, which I think, to Moira's point, will help us mid-year when we look at that and say, how are we doing? We'll be able to draw out some of those specifics to talk about how we're doing in these particular areas.
And for me, I think it really, you know, in the remote part of what's happening right now, it's really a way to reassure our parents and our students that we haven't lost our focus. We know what our job is, right? We have to be flexible. Things have to change. Some things might have to slow down. But it's still these are really important pieces of work that we've been doing. Some of them that we've been doing for years, some of which are more new, but continue to be a priority of our teaching faculty.
And I like that through the conversation, when we were putting this together to bring to you tonight, we were trying to make sure that no matter what happens, where on that continuum we end up, this document can be pulled out and looked at. So whether we end up staying in hybrid just for a few more weeks and then move to fully open, but maintain 9% of our kids at home, whether we move to a fully distanced platform in the winter months and stay there for a protracted period of time, or whether by June we're back to normal. Would this document be usable in any of those situations?
Right.
I think that even with the conversation, I think maybe better with the conversation that we've had, the answer remains yes. And I think that's the important. It's not just for these next 3 weeks.
Right.
It's for this school year, even though we don't know where this school year is going to take us. And there's just no way that we will know.
Well, and I think that I mean, every year when you present the budget to us, you start with, you know, the beginning, and, you know, that even though we might not be having a huge initiative like kindergarten or whatever it is, that it's not status quo, we're not stagnant, and we're always moving forward. And I think, you know, now we insert pandemic, and we're still moving forward. We're not just sort of coasting or.
I like that a lot.
You know.
I like that a lot.
Well, the only thing that I would add is that I understand the priorities are always going to be student-centric, right? The only thing that, you know, this year of all years that's a little different here is the safety and well-being of our staff. And I'm wondering if in that first priority, that might be able to be highlighted as well with the students. You know, it talks about places for learning.
Yeah.
Maybe it's places for learning and working. You know, because it's more now than ever. It's there.
For everybody.
It's for everybody.
You know, that's an interesting point, because at one point the word students was in there.
Yep.
We specifically took it out because it was places of learning for teachers as
Right.
much as
True.
for students. But
And I was
think-
going back and forth with that in my head as well.
But
So,
I think you're right, maybe calling that out and naming that this year in a way that we haven't named it before, right?
Yeah.
And so whether it's, you know, yeah, I think we could absolutely do something with that. You know,
I'm
students
so
and,
sorry, John, are you talking about the first?
The first priority.
The
First priority.
Yeah.
Oh,
you know, places of learning for both our students and our staff, right? You know,
Yeah.
safe and healthy places for students and for staff.
Correct.
Right? And it'd be interesting to pull the last 10 years of what it's looked like, because at times it says students, at other times it said student and staff.
Yep.
I think it was for all, and now it's just places of learning.
Mhm.
But
And you could interpret that first priority as everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. But I think calling it out specifically, especially the safe and healthy portion of
Yep.
it, right, around for all.
other thoughts? Anyone that is on Zoom that would like to say anything? I want to make sure that we include everyone in the conversation.
Hi, yeah, it's Julia Chaff. I wanted to kind of add a comment about the third priority relating to cultural competence or cultural responsiveness. The main focus that we're trying to take at the high school is twofold. One is not to take our cultural responsiveness approach and make it an add-on. In other words, this week it's going to be multicultural literature, and next week we're going to be reading works from the Western canon. We're actually really trying to integrate multiple perspectives, multiple texts at the high school, not just in the history classes, but in the literature classes as well. And then the last comment I wanted to make is a lot of the focus is going to be on argumentation and rhetorical analysis. So in order to teach those strategies effectively and connect it to writing that students do, you want to expose them to as many perspectives as possible, including ones that differ from their own. And I think that can be a common misconception in the public, that by doing that, we're pushing a particular agenda perhaps, but truthfully, the focus on the argumentation and focusing on that as our touchstone is to allow students to experience as many perspectives as possible, and then use that as a model for developing their own arguments.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
I can make sure that we have that reflected somewhere. I do have some work to do on this.
With regard to that, I hear that we're doing a focus this year in language, in English and in history. Is that a particular focus for this year? And eventually we're going to get to things like science. There's a lot about science that has been taught that substantiates racism, and a lot of, quote, scientific theory has been used for a long time to justify the things that we're now rejecting. And I know that can be taught in history, but if it's taught within the discipline itself, so students can see how science itself has evolved, that only spreads it all the more in the sense that you're integrating it, that in the way that Julia was suggesting.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. No, there's no intention of segregating science and math out of this conversation. When we met with Dr. Seiler, he met with all of the coaches in the district, including the math coach and the technology integration specialist. The examples we've used here tonight have solely come from history or from language arts, but we intend for this to be looked at across all subject areas. And when Julia was talking, I wrote down a note for myself again, that this conversation has to be about the way that we do stuff. It is not stuff for us to do. And that is always an important distinction for me. And we need to make sure that this document makes that clear, but that's also the way in which we are planning on approaching this conversation. It's not a thing we do on Fridays or a thing we do for the month of February. It's the way we do things, and that's an important distinction.
Other thoughts?
I really do appreciate the conversation. This has been tremendously helpful. It's been fun having both sides of the team here. I know that it was a little focused and condensed, but I think that that's important this year. And we'll continue this at your next meeting in October.
Absolutely.
Nope. Yep.
All right. That was our agenda for this evening.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it really is, these are wonderful priorities, and it's something that there's no doubt we'll get there.
And I think this is the right time. We've got the buildings open, we've got kids coming in, we know that we've got some issues to address, but it's important that the community knows that we're not leaving them behind. This is not a year of survival. It continues to be a year where we focus on moving forward, to Amy's point, as we always have.
Terrific. Before we adjourn, I just want to note for the viewing public, and actually for all of us here today, again, this is our first attempt at a hybrid meeting. Please excuse me, there were times where you might have seen me texting. I was communicating with Moira Rader, who is remote, so that she could feed back the experience. So we have some things to work on in terms of perhaps microphone placement, et cetera, so we can make sure that people hear us.
It looks like we're frozen. I've like been trying to
Oh, we.
show,
does,
that's what I was saying, like.
Oh,
It does look like our visual is.
I gotcha.
And on YouTube, I just see.
Okay. Oh, is that right?
Space.
Okay, so we'll have some things.
Yeah.
We'll have some things.
It looks like we're a still photo,
We
but we can work on camera placement and some other things as well.
But I appreciate everyone's participation. We will see what we need to tweak. And I'll be interested if any board members or any administrators or anyone who participated in this meeting have some feedback about the experience, whether you were in the room, whether you were remote, how that felt, what we could do to make it feel more inclusive. That's going to be really important, because we're only going to keep doing it this way if the public feels like they can hear us, and if the participants feel like they can be really part of the meeting. All right. Unless anyone has final thoughts, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Joe Bellino, second. Kristen Peck, second. All in favor? Aye. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
To see everyone.
We're waving at the
Good
screen.
night.
Oh,
I was looking at the screen on camera.